I have almost 5 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get going if that's okay. I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight, virtually here tonight, for a discussion of our fall and winter's decision about Sewanee Athletics that was released earlier this week. I think most of you who saw the release saw that, yes, we are going to provide our student athletes an opportunity to compete. And what we're going to do is protect our bubble and play home competitions only, provided our protocols are met. I want to remind everybody that we do have a hard stop at 6 o'clock, and we'll find ways to continue the conversation. We've had about 20 questions that I've tried to summarize that I'll be asking, and I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but we will find ways to continue the conversation. So thank you for your indulgence of that. You can submit, for the record, questions in the Q&A function, and we will do our best to get to all the questions that you may raise. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our 17th Vice Chancellor, Dr. Reuben Brigady, to introduce his thoughts on the decision. Thank you, Dr. Brigady.
There you go. Thanks, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, athletes and families, good evening. Thank you for joining our town hall tonight to discuss our decision about how we are going to pursue athletics in the winter season. What I'd like to do is to give you a sense of both the framework within which we made the decision, to give you a sense of how the decision came about, a bit more of some more information beyond what is obviously available in the press release, and to correct a few misperceptions that I know I've seen circulating in social media elsewhere. And then happy to take your questions, both those that have been submitted and then also those that come through the chat. First of all, let me give you a bit of context of where we are. So as we sit here on December 10th, 2020, we are entering the deadliest phase of this pandemic. The situation in the country is worse now than it was when we evacuated the mountain in March, and than it was when we resumed on-campus instruction in August and September, which also included, as you know, the canceling of the entire fall season. Further, it's also important to note that the head director of the Center for Disease Control, Dr. Redfield, said last week publicly that he expects that this December, January, and February will be the worst 3 months in the history of American public health. That's where we are. And to reiterate our physical position here on the mountain and what it means in terms of how we've been approaching public health, generally speaking, with regard to the bubbles and whatnot, the principal reason why we have been so strict with regard to our public health guidelines is because our remote location means that advanced life support options for us in our community are very limited. There are exactly 25 ICU beds within a 50-mile radius of where I am sitting right now, right next to All Saints Chapel. And given the speed with which this virus spreads, given how we know it can either be carried asymptomatically by some people or make some people extremely sick but not require hospitalization, or require hospitalization for others that need airway support, and we don't have particularly good information about why some people develop extremely serious cases and why others do not, we simply cannot afford to have a massive outbreak here on the campus, which is why we said all semester long that if we could not have broad compliance with our public health guidelines, in addition to our testing regime, and if we saw an outbreak on the mountain, our response would be to evacuate the mountain because we could not keep everybody safe. Now, this is the framework within which we went into our discussions with our other colleagues in the Southern Athletic Association conference. The other thing that I think it's very important to say before I get into more details is the framework and the principle that was articulated by the president of the conference, my colleague, Dr. Daniel Coleman at Birmingham Southern, who said, as we were all beginning to have these conversations, that he believed that we should practice the principle of institutional autonomy as we tried to come up with a framework for how all 8 schools in the conference would be able to compete and pursue sports for the winter, as well as the retroactive season for the fall. The reason he suggested that is because he said that the institutions had had different experiences in managing the pandemic, with some schools such as Rhodes in the middle of Memphis not opening at all, to us, Swani, on a mountaintop that had been able to open and kept our transmission rates dramatically low, and everywhere else in between. And also because of our relative geographic positions and our relative access to healthcare and advanced life support. And that we all needed to factor those things in as we try to come up with a decision coming forward. Let me also say that I believe deeply in the value of athletics for their educational and other benefits. I was a college athlete as well. I was a varsity fencer at the Naval Academy. I fenced foil. And as an interesting side note, I'd never fenced before I got to the Naval Academy. I worked very hard at it and I actually got pretty good. And in a short period of time, in my sophomore year, I actually qualified to go to the Junior Olympics in Colorado in foil. And as I was preparing to do that, the Naval Academy eliminated the fencing program completely for budget cuts. And thus my Junior Olympic dreams were dashed. So I understand from my own experience what it feels like to have an athletic opportunity that you've worked so hard for taken away from you. But I also want you to understand a bit more detail about what the actual content of the decision was and why. So in correcting a couple of things that have been in the ether in the last 24 hours, I've seen it reported that Swani was the only school in our conference to vote not to compete. That is inaccurate. The vote amongst our SAA colleagues was unanimous, including Swani, to proceed with a winter schedule as well as a retroactive fall schedule. The difference was how we decided to approach it. That is what is in the public press release. Now, let me talk a little bit about what is not in there and what led to this decision. Let me stipulate from the very beginning that I have great faith and regard for all of my colleagues, all the presidents at the other SAA institutions. And as I said from the beginning, we followed the principle that was articulated by our colleagues at Birmingham Southern, that every school had to make ultimately its decisions based on what it saw from its own experience and from its own respective geographical position. And I am absolutely certain from their perspectives, from where they sit, all of my fellow presidents are making decisions which they believe to be in the best interest of their students and their university communities. Having said that, as we entered our discussions with our colleagues about how we could compete safely, Swani made clear that for us, the red line, the absolute non-negotiable, was that athletes had to wear masks during competition, and all associated athletic staff had to wear masks while their teams were competing with each other. The reason we insisted on this is because masking, distancing, and preferably being outdoors are the three interventions that not only we know work in minimizing the spread of the disease, but that also our public health officials, our national public health officials, are literally begging all Americans to adhere to stop the spread of the disease. To include also, by the way, trying to avoid travel, as you recall, prior to the Thanksgiving holiday. Notwithstanding that, we were prepared to have our athletes be in close proximity with other athletes to compete, to travel to compete, so long as everybody was masked. Sewanee is the only school in the SAA that agrees with that approach. We could not come to an agreement for other schools to mask their athletes and their staff during competition. And some other schools actually were of the view that masking their athletes during competition is harmful to their health, more harmful than the prophylactic advantage of protecting athletes and others from the spread of the disease when athletes are in close proximity to each other during competition. This is a point on which we have a respectful but fundamental disagreement with our colleagues. The reason, therefore, that we said, okay, we will play, but we will only play home games at Swani, is not only because traveling is obviously a concerning vector and concerns with the bubble and whatnot, but because this is the place where we can ensure that all the public health protocols are followed to include masking. And so we welcome any team in any of our sports, conference and non-conference, to come to the mountain to compete against us, so long as they follow the public health guidelines to include masking. And we have agreed to make it as easy on them as possible to do so. Paying for their travel, paying for their accommodation, paying for their meals, and paying for their testing while they mask and compete. Now, one might ask, okay, well, if we have this incredible ability to test, why don't we just, why is masking so important? The answer is that it is still possible to have the disease and to transmit it and have a negative test. The PCR tests that we use are very accurate and are very good at detecting viral loads at a certain sensitivity within people that have it. But it is also entirely possible that somebody could contract the disease in a 24-hour period, have it, and not test positive for the test, which is why the prophylactic issue of masking is so important. Now, let me also say that I've heard the critique. How is it that Sewanee is the only school in our entire conference that couldn't figure this out? Everybody else figured this out. Why can't we? Let me encourage you to open your aperture a little bit and see the broader scope of the problem. As of this morning, the NCAA has publicly reported that there are 10 schools in Division III, 10 conferences within Division III, to include the SAA, which are proceeding with winter sports. There are 20 schools reported by the NCAA, 20 conferences within the NCAA Division III that have decided as of this morning not to have winter sports or to cancel their winter conference competition or championships, or both. And there are 5 Division III schools, Division III conferences, keep making that mistake, I apologize. 5 Division III conferences, at least as of this morning, that have still yet to make their decision. So what one can glean from that is the following. Notwithstanding our best understanding of the science, at this point, amongst similarly sized schools, Division III, there is not consensus about whether or not it is safe to play at all or how one should do so. But if one had to understand the weight of consensus within currently reporting Division III schools, it is 2-1 against playing at all as of this morning. Now, as I said, I completely respect my colleagues at other institutions. But as we understand the science, as we understand our position here, we believe that masking is essential. And we welcome any team to come here to engage with us on those terms. The final thing I will say, because I've heard from an awful lot of baseball parents, an awful lot of baseball players, is we have not yet made any decision about the spring. Neither we as Swani nor the conference as a whole. I would very much hope that we will learn things one way or the other that make baseball possible and other spring sports. Frankly, what I really hope we learn is that schools will understand the importance of masking and that it is entirely possible to compete healthily and safely while masked, so that we can play a full, proper spring schedule. But the reason we are not moving on this point is that you cannot negotiate with the virus. You cannot. In our discussions with our fellow presidents in the context of the SAA, we heard from some schools who said, well, you know, they had 200 or 300 reported cases, reported, not total, reported cases during the course of the semester. And they worked through it, they managed it fine, that's fine. I completely respect that in their position. We cannot tolerate that level of outbreak. We simply cannot. Nor do we think that it is too much to ask to wear masks, as many of you athletes have done this past fall during your practices. And so we remain in talks with other schools in our conference and with other schools outside of our conference to see who is willing to come for an all expenses paid vacation and trip to the mountain to come compete. We have until December 20th. We've asked for our colleagues until December 20th to lock that in. And we will continue to press forward in order to make that happen. So I'm happy to take your questions. Again, I completely understand the disappointment that many of you feel. We have not written off winter sports entirely, nor have we even touched the spring. We are insisting on a protocol that we think makes sense in order to keep everybody safe. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. I think you covered a lot of territory there. There's another school, the Centennial Conference, just announced today later that they were not going to compete in fall and winter sports, and that's Gettysburg, Johns Hopkins, Franklin, and Marshall. So that was just released a few minutes ago. One question, do you think this decision from a parent diminishes our standing in the SAA, especially since we were a founding member, and what should be our perception of your support of Sewanee Athletics now and in the future?
Let me answer the second question first. I am a strong supporter of Sewanee Athletics. I have told multiple people that when we begin our next campaign, our next fundraising campaign, I've already decided mentally that our number 2 priority is going to be raising funds to refurbish and renew our athletic facilities, you know, weight rooms, training rooms, et cetera. Because we simply have to have first-class 21st century athletic facilities. I understand and believe in the value of athletics in terms of the types of students that they tend to bring, you know, people that have to be disciplined, that have teams, teammates that they work with. I'm supportive of all of that. And so I'm absolutely supportive of that. And I respectfully disagree that the fact that we are making a decision based on our understanding of the science, that means that we will not compete outside of Sewanee with other people, unmasked, in close proximity, indoors, in the midst of the worst winter that is predicted in the history of American public health, means that we're not supportive of athletics. It means that we are in the middle of a global pandemic of biblical proportions, and we simply have to be responsible about how we approach it. And I can't speak for any other school or any other institution about how they approach it. I respect them. But we are going to do it this way because of our own particular situation, because of what we understand is necessary in order to keep our community safe. What was the first part of the question?
It's part of our standing in the SAA since we were a founding member.
It's a good question. I have been in contact both with other SAA presidents as a whole and also individually. We understand and respect each other's positions on this. I suspect that the fact that we have been both very forthright and collegial will be remembered favorably. Again, as I said, we did not vote no. We voted yes to competition in order to maintain consensus and ensure unanimity with our peers. But we also follow the principle that was articulated by the president of our conference that each school has to follow the guidelines based on its own particular unique situation. And the other, let's also keep the other thing in mind. We will be Dr. Gregoire from CDC said that by June, he expects that everybody in the country that wants a vaccine will be able to get one. This is extraordinary. To be frank, when we were planning to reopen this fall, and we knew the record of creating vaccinations against coronaviruses was actually really quite minimal. We were absolutely preparing for the notion that we would have to be in this COVID normal for another 2 or 3 years. And the fact that we can be looking towards the fall and returning pretty much back to normal is just extraordinary. I should also say, by the way, because I saw this other question, the NCAA, and Mark, you're going to correct me if I get this wrong, the NCAA has issued a blanket waiver for all athletes this year.
That's correct, yes.
Able to maintain their eligibility, notwithstanding whatever individual schools or conferences may choose with regard to how they address this pandemic.
Right. Thank you. A question from a basketball parent. Can you refer us to the particular study or statistics that cites COVID hospitalizations and death among college students and student athletes that gave you pause to lead you to this decision? Is there a particular study?
I have seen studies that show both things. So for example, we have seen studies that have circulated suggesting that masking is harmful to elite athletes, given all the obvious respiratory restrictions. And we have also been made aware of what our public health officials nationally are asking of us. Now, I will say this. I am not a medical professional and I have not read the literature. I live with a medical professional who has served as a frontline general in this fight. And in fact, the reason she's not here with me in Swani right now is because she's back in DC working in COVID wards, treating patients. And she would anecdotally tell you that she's never seen patients this sick in her life. 30-year-olds having strokes, hemorrhages, pulmonary hemorrhages that is causing them to bleed out, et cetera. But I didn't base this decision on my wife's view. What we have had since we started this are not only 2 public health officers who work on staff with us, both who have MPHs, one who has an MD, but we've also had a kitchen cabinet made up of Dr. Walter Merrill, who is the Chief of Staff at Vanderbilt Medical Center, and Dr. Paul Irwin, who is the head of the School of Public Health at University of Alabama, Birmingham. We consulted both of them thoroughly as we made this decision. They're both Sewanee alums, by the way, I should say, which is also principally why they're part of our kitchen cabinet. And they both agreed that absolutely, if you're going to compete, then the only way to do so reasonably safely was wearing masks. And I should say that with their advice, with the advice of our own public health officers on staff, and in consultation with our Board of Regents, whom I consulted and briefed this past Monday, Tuesday, I should say, fully Tuesday, that the board is in unanimous, enthusiastic agreement that this is the right course of action in order to preserve the safety of our community.
Thank you, sir. Another question from, I think, a basketball parent. If Sewanee is willing to allocate resources for visiting team travel expenses, is it a feasible alternative to test Sewanee players as they return from away games in lieu of paying for visitors' travel?
2 points. First of all, it is simply not safe, in our view, to have athletes in close proximity with other athletes making physical and respiratory exertion indoors in the midst of the worst winter of our public health history. It's just not. And given that, the issue, quite frankly, if our other SAA colleagues had all agreed to masking, we'd be having a very different conversation. That would be a much, much, much more difficult decision. Because then the decision would be, as you essentially point out, well, if everybody's masking and if we kind of know where everybody is, well, can we at least just kind of test people when they come back? And then what's the appropriate quarantine period for people that are re-entering and whatnot, et cetera. And this goes back again to the testing regime. The testing is not a tool in and of itself on which we rely. It is the totality of the public health regime, the testing, the tracing and isolation, plus the mask wearing and the distancing. I will remind you that we had a small outbreak mid-semester that was with a particular affinity group, which I think is probably fair to say in this group, was one of our sports teams. Now, assuming that everybody was doing what they were supposed to do, staying on campus, not leaving the bubble, wearing their masks, then one can reasonably ask the question, how did they get the disease? Because it's not like getting a kidney stone, right? It doesn't happen sort of intrinsically. You have to be in contact with other people that have the disease. And our contact tracing did not reveal that any of these students were in contact with anybody that we knew of that had the disease. And so the testing helped us identify it and cut it off, but it certainly didn't help us, but it didn't stop the initial spread to begin with. And so the next question logically would be, well, then fine, what's perhaps we should, instead of having a blanket risk avoidance strategy, maybe we got to have a more of a risk management strategy and balancing strategy, so that we could say we're going to accept, as opposed to an 8/100th% positivity rate, a 2% positivity rate. And if we have a certain number of athletes test positive, that's worth the price of competing. To which I would say the following. First, I agree that there is some level of risk that is acceptable in order to pursue athletics, which is why we are prepared to allow teams to travel if they're competing against other people that were masked. It is also why we are still going to allow competitors to come to campus to compete, masked. And also why we are prepared to take the risk to allow people to come into the bubble, to test well quarantined upon arrival, and then play so long as they are masked, because you simply have to have the redundancy. Someone who could have a negative test today could have a positive test tomorrow and still be contagious. It's a lower probability, but it's still one. And again, we are not in the middle of Atlanta. We're on the top of a mountain with very little access to advanced life support, and therefore we simply cannot allow this virus to take hold here. And so I would respectfully submit that we are taking the risks to allow competition to occur. What we are not doing is taking what we consider to be risks that are unprudent relative to the other options that are available.
Thank you. I think I can answer the first part. When is the deadline for SAA schools to notify us on their intentions to play fall and winter sports? And that's December 20th.
That's great.
Coming up in about 10 days. If they decline or some decline because of our restrictions, would you consider allowing competition with non-conference teams if they follow our safety protocols?
Absolutely, 100%.
Great. Okay, thank you. And then you've answered a lot on masking, but here's something a little more specific. Why mask in golf and tennis when players in those sports can be socially distanced most of the time?
So here's the thing. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You should wear a mask. I wear a mask when I walk the dog in the morning by myself at 7 a.m. I wear a mask while I'm working out in the gym at the Fowler Center. When we were back in the Northern Virginia area staying with my in-laws, I wore a mask in the house all the time because although we tested negative, we knew the others had tested negative recently. You simply don't know who could absolutely have it. And we know that family groups are clustered, so we wear a mask. And to those who are saying, but I saw you, Vice Chancellor, riding a horse without your mask, aren't you attributable to the same rules? Let me address that directly, because it gets to the golf and tennis question. As I mentioned, when I posted that photo, first of all, the photo was taken over Thanksgiving after the bubble had been broken. We had all gone home. Second, as I mentioned, we all were wearing masks while dismounted, meaning why people could be in close proximity to each other, notwithstanding the fact that we're still outdoors. We did not wear masks while mounted for two reasons. First is that it is almost impossible to come within 10 feet of another human being on a horseback when you're both mounted, unless your horses are right on top of each other. It just can't be done. And therefore, the likelihood of being able to transmit the disease outdoors while galloping, while 3 or 4 horse lengths away from somebody is essentially zero. But the other issue, which gets to the golf and tennis issue, is that it's a safety issue. I took my glasses off right now because if I wore them, you would see the reflection in the mirror, which is not very good. But I wear them when I ride. And for those of you who tried to wear masks while wearing glasses, you know that your glasses fog. And having fogged up glasses while mounted and galloping on a horse is a safety hazard, which is why I wasn't wearing a mask in that photo, or while wearing a mask while mounted and riding. Now, to the question of why do tennis and golf athletes have to wear a mask, it's a reasonably fair question. You should probably, broadly speaking, argue that when you're separated by the length of a tennis court, or when you're on the 5th hole and your competition's on the 6th or the 3rd or whatever, you're not going to be near enough anybody to compete. The challenge, of course, is that everybody always thinks that they're following the rules. And so whether you're in between games on a tennis court and you're coming within close proximity to your opponent while you're in between points and you're taking a break, or whether you're on the golf course and you're coming off the course, or you're in for whatever close proximity of the golfer while you're both unmasked for a long period of time, it's just not safe. And to be frank, especially for our golfers, with all due respect, if our runners and football players and our cross players can wear masks with that level of exertion, you should be able to wear a mask while you're golfing. But depending on the particular circumstances, of course, I mean, we can sort of think about it. But the general issues, and one is general kind of public health, which is that what I have discovered as we have collectively tried to manage this disease is that everyone always thinks that they're the exception. That they're the ones who are always going to follow the rules, or why can't they follow rules in that particular circumstance? And that, quite frankly, is precisely why the virus spreads. And so we all have to hold the line. And the good news is we don't have to hold it for that much longer, and we'll be on the other side of this by the fall.
Thank you. Would you share your, talking about the bubble, would you share your rationale for not allowing fans to attend competition, even if it's a limited number and social distancing and masking guidelines could be upheld?
Again, same point. Everyone always thinks they're the exception. And if you allow fans to come and everyone's going to socially distance, then why can't we have girlfriends come from, or boyfriends come from Alabama or Atlanta, just kind of comes from that. If they're going to be socially distant, why can't we have people come in and eat in McClurg Hall as long as they're going to be socially distant? It tends to compound on each other. Now, I can always hear someone saying, well, what about the town? What about shenanigans? What about the blue chair? I will tell you quite frankly that we have been in constant dialogue with our colleagues in the village to encourage them as strongly as possible to enforce masking in the various venues. Some of them do, some of them don't, and it is a constant worry for those of us who are in charge of trying to manage the bubble. At some point, it's just math. It's just basic math. The more people who come and engage, particularly those who are coming from outside the bubble, to come and be in proximity with their beloved students. So yes, you're going to come, you're going to see your student play basketball or play volleyball. You're going to be socially distant while you're watching. Everyone's going to wear a mask, although you're indoors. But of course, you're going to want to see them after the match. You'll give them a hug because you're so sort of grateful, good to see him, whatever. Maybe you take them out. You could take them out to a dinner. You know, it's not really big a deal. I know I'm safe. You know you're safe. It's all fine. It's all good until there's a transmission of the virus. And I don't mean to be flippant about this at all. I really don't. And believe me, I completely understand the desire for everyone to want to be in close proximity as if the virus in the pandemic were not happening. But we simply have to be stringent while we also continue to try to find ways to allow some semblance of the normality to occur until vaccines are open and we're on the other side of this.
Thank you. That brings me to my next question. Regarding spring sports, number one, would you discuss the possibility of competing in spring sports? Is it possible to make a decision about spring sports closer to the time when our teams are able to compete? Three parts, I'm sorry. Will the availability of a COVID-19 vaccine affect the decision of how Sewanee plays sports in the spring? If so, how?
Sure. Okay. I'll answer that question. Mark, why don't you scroll through the Q&A and make sure you're taking some.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. We'll do. Thanks.
So with regard to spring sports, as I mentioned earlier, yes, we have not yet made a decision about spring sports. From my perspective, the longer we are able to leave that, the better, because we will learn more. I suspect that as our sister schools compete in January and early February, we are going to learn some things one way or another. Either that they have proven, notwithstanding all of our reservations, that competing in close proximity, unmasked and indoors is safe. There's been essentially no transmission. Or we'll learn the opposite. Therefore, if we're going to compete, masks are essential or some combination thereof. Obviously, by virtue of the decision that we're making, we presume it's probably going to be more the latter than the former, but we'll see. And I, therefore, would absolutely endorse our being willing to make or being able to make a decision about spring sports as late as possible. And Mark and others will coordinate with our other athletic directors in the conference to see when our absolute last drop dead date is to make a decision. With regard to a vaccine, I mean, there is simply not going to be a vaccine that's going to be distributed in every level of quality to impact our decision about this spring. It's just not going to happen. Best case scenario is, as Dr. Gregoire said, that it will be sometime in June, where we can expect there to be widespread distribution of the vaccine. A vaccine, by the way, which has to be cold stored, it has to be taken twice. And even then, you're only at full immunity some 7 to 10 days after the second dose. And this, by the way, in the context of a country where there is already, prior to this pandemic, been massive skepticism about vaccinations as a general proposition, and where there is serious concern about vaccinations amongst certain populations of our country. And so we simply have to wait to see more what the vaccination effort looks like and how it's rolled out before we can make an informed decision about how that's going to impact our community and how we approach it.
Thank you. Here's a question about student athlete input. Were the student athlete team captains or any group of students consulted during the decision-making process?
I had a number of students reach out to me individually. We did not have a formal meeting with team captains for a variety of reasons. One is simply the nature of the timing of the issue. Two, with respect, kind of had a sense of what people were going to say, which is we want to play, other schools are playing, we think that it's worth the risk. Why would Swani do something differently than everybody else? All of which has been articulated in the context of conversation that has occurred over the last 24 hours over social media and through email, et cetera. And as I said before, I completely empathize with and understand the desire to play a regular season. We simply do not agree with our fellow conference colleagues about the provisions under which those things can safely happen. And this is not like debating conference schedules or the color scheme of our conference, in which we may prefer, red over blue and they choose gray over green, but whatever, right? We'll go along to get along. No, I am not responsible to the SAA or the NCAA or to any other university. I'm responsible to the student body of Swani as a whole, the families from which those students come, and to the community that lives here as mayor. And that is the framework within which I made that decision, even as we've tried to figure out a way for athletes to compete under conditions which we deem to be safe, or more safe than not.
Here's another one from the Q&A. Do the same restrictions on student athletes apply to prospective students visiting the domain?
Sure.
Will they be subject to the same restrictions?
Sure. Yes and no. So the reason we made the decision to allow students, prospective students, to come visit the domain this fall is that for the ongoing health of the university, we simply have to have a strong freshman class in the fall. For 40% of the students we admit, the very first time that they've ever had any engagement with Swani is when they came here to visit. And so we believe that allowing students to come was a mission, prospective students to come was a mission critical decision. Having said that, we also severely restricted it in order to ensure that there would be no interaction between the students we're visiting and the student body as a whole. Because keep in mind, the student body is the center of gravity for protecting this community from this virus. Why? Because everything that we know about watching how this virus spreads suggests that it spreads when people are in close proximity for extended periods of time. That is in particular in bars and restaurants, unmasked in close proximity for extended periods of time, especially indoors. So that's bars and restaurants, that is in living quarters, whether that be on cruise ships or combatant vessels or nursing homes or dormitories, as we saw the virus tear through the campuses of a number of universities this past fall, leading them to close within just 2 or 3 weeks of being open. And so it's vital that we protect the students, which is why it's so important, for example, for parents not to come during the semester, because of course they'll be closely in contact with their students. Of course they would. And it's also why, despite the fact our allowing prospective students to come, they all had to wear a mask. They all had to limit the people that would come with them to just one other visitor who also had to wear a mask. They could not interact with any other students other than their tour guide, who also was tested more regularly. They were not allowed inside any academic buildings. They weren't allowed inside the dining hall. The only place they could go inside on campus was inside All Saints Chapel. And so that's why we made that decision and how we managed and why they visited.
As a quick follow-up to that, could you touch on how recruiting of prospects is going for the university in terms of applications and admissions?
Those of you who are students, no doubt, used the Common App to apply when you came to Swani. Use of the Common App across the country this year is down 8%, meaning that there is a decrease in students applying to university by at least 8% this year so far. Applications to Swani compared to this time last year are up 2%. That is a good thing. And our applicant pool is stronger than it was previously, with an increase of our overall applicant pool GPA average thus far from about 3.61 to about 3.8, and increases in the average SAT and ACT scores that are also substantial. So we are just now at the early decision point. We clearly have not finished building a class, but it is actually really quite encouraging, particularly given the circumstance within which the country finds itself.
Thank you. Another question: if this is the biggest health crisis in our history, then why jeopardize students at all?
It is a fair question. It's a fair question. Why open it all? And I will tell you that as we were preparing to open this past summer, this was the live question of whether or not we could do it. I had a meeting with my cabinet the third week of July to say, this is a now go, no go decision point. If there are any concerns one way or the other, this is the time for us to discuss them. And there were substantial concerns. But of all the concerns that we heard, it was my view that none of them were beyond redress with appropriate leadership. And so we proceeded. And we ended this semester with exactly 26 confirmed coronavirus cases amongst faculty, staff, and students, with roughly half of those being students, and without a single documented transmission between students and faculty or staff. And tragically, notwithstanding all that, we did lose a student, as you know, Ava Hinkson, in a tragic horseback riding accident 4 days before the semester ended. So what that means is that we now know how to have an in-person educational experience and keep our community safe. Those are 26 positive tests out of nearly 22,000 administered, for a positivity rate of 0.08%, which is extraordinary. And so, frankly, given that, the safest betting would be that we do exactly what we did in the fall rather. In fact, maybe even be more harsh, because as we start the semester in February, it's going to be cold, which means that we will not be able to take advantage of outdoor spaces as much as we were in the fall semester. And people are going to be indoors more, which is precisely creates the conditions for spread. But we have decided to try to figure out, notwithstanding that, how we can have athletics. But it's simply, from our perspective, it simply does not make sense to do that unmasked. And that's our line. And that's why we've made the decision that we do, and why we are inviting students who agree, or inviting schools that agree with that and are prepared to adhere to the circumstances to come here to Sewanee and compete against us.
Thank you. There have been a couple of questions come in about spring sports and the deadline for tuition bills and having the spring sport decision made. Do you have thoughts about that, knowing that I think the spring sport tuition bill deadline is about January 15th?
Right. I'll be frank. If I had to, we simply, well, I will say this. In order for us to compete in regular conference play in the spring, one of the several things would have to happen. One is that notwithstanding everything that we've just said, and notwithstanding the decisions of 2/3 of Division III schools thus far, we would have to have solid evidence that it is actually possible to have intercollegiate sports and intercollegiate competition unmasked safely without spread of the virus. On its merits, it does not make sense to me, which is why we've made the decision that we did. But I respect the fact that we could all be proven wrong. That would be one thing. The second thing that would have to happen is that the opposite of that, which is that one of the lessons that would have to be learned from those who compete is that, in fact, it actually really is the right thing to do to wear a mask, and it's entirely possible, and you can compete safely while wearing a mask. And if that were the case, then I would be open to even to travel a full regular spring season.
Thank you. Here's a quick.
I'm sorry. And the third, obviously, something miraculous, the disease magically goes away, or we're able to vaccinate the whole country in 30 days or whatever else, right? And so, but those are the two more likely scenarios that will impact our decision. And then with regard to the date, I wish I could tell you that we will know for certain which of those two things is going to be the case by January 15th. Obviously, the more we wait, the more data we will have. But we are having to take this almost day by day as it comes.
Quick question. We talked about fans earlier, but what about students? Would they be allowed to attend athletic contests should we hold them?
The decision as of now is no, for a variety of reasons. First of all, we don't allow large gatherings indoors, period. We have allowed people, for example, frat parties outdoors because outdoors are safer environments. We have, and as you well know, based on our experience with the bubble, we actually doubled the number of people that could attend outdoor events towards the end of the semester from 50 to 100. The idea that we could safely have large numbers of people indoors well, actually, let me put it this way. For students who are absolutely who are currently inside the bubble, I would be willing for us to kind of think about it, because there are some spaces on campus where we do, for example, religious services inside All Saints Chapel. And if in consultation with our public health officials, if we could have spectators inside, socially distant, at a small enough capacity that we are confident that it would be safe, and we could actually track the people who are coming in so that we could do contact tracing afterwards, as we do, for example, with religious services in All Saints Chapel. That'd certainly be a possibility. I think it'd be worth discussing.
Okay, thank you. I had a question about the NCAA. There's an NCAA coronavirus panel that issues guidelines on playing sports. Why not just adhere to their position? And I happen to have, I think this is their position as of today, about testing. Basketball and volleyball test 3 times a week on non-consecutive days. Football, field hockey, soccer, lacrosse, weekly PCR tests 72 hours prior to competition. And then individual sports, including baseball and softball, continue weekly university testing plan. Basically, the NCAA COVID protocol right now with regards to testing.
I respect the NCAA. They are not a disinterested party and have an incentive to try to find ways to return to competition. We do not agree with the NCAA with regard to the imperative for masking. And I would note that, let me just put it this way. What the Center for Disease Control and what the Centers for Infectious Disease that Dr. Fauci leads have said is that the three critical things, absent a vaccine, are to wear a mask, wash your hands, keep your distance, and if possible, to be outdoors. We're even now suggesting that everybody should wear a mask indoors when they're not with their family and not by themselves. Bringing people in close proximity to compete winter sports indoors violates every one of those. And so it's simply, from my perspective and the perspective of the health consultants we are engaging, simply does not make sense that if our national health authorities are telling us to do those three things, and yet we fear we can compete in close proximity doing the opposite of those three things, then one can reasonably expect to keep players and others people they come in contact with safe. And if we have an outbreak on the mountain and I have to evacuate, I am not going to be able to say, well, the NCAA told us we could do it and therefore we should be good. As I repeatedly tell everyone on the team, on the staff here, when we're trying to make hard decisions and we're consulting many different ways and there are multiple different perspectives, at the end of the day, when a decision has to be made and I make it, it is not because I have 100% confidence that I am certain that I'm right. It is because I have 100% certainty that I am accountable. And therefore, if we cannot mask against components, we are not going to go elsewhere to play. And we will invite opponents to come compete against us so long as they wear masks.
Thank you. We're down to about 5 minutes. I had a question. I would like to know the thought process in allowing professors to come and go from the bubble, but not allowing a sports team to come and go. And kind of as a follow-up, how are we going to combat travelers coming into our bubble next semester?
So with regard to professors and staff, obviously the challenge is that many of our staff and our professors live off the domain. And therefore, the only way for them to engage is for them to come back and forth. Now, interestingly, we have only had one professor test positive for the coronavirus. And based on consultations with that person, it is almost certain that they contracted it elsewhere, far off the mountain. And we have not had any transmission between faculty and students. Certainly none in the classroom. So interestingly, our classrooms are the safest place on campus. Why? Because everybody wears a mask when they're in the classroom. The professor ensures it. Because we have decreased section sizes to ensure that appropriate spacing is possible inside a class. And because we've also made use of tents, which in many circumstances allows greater airflow to decrease the likelihood of the transmission of the disease. Now, amongst the employees that have tested positive, the vast majority of those are staff who live out of the mountain and live in the local communities, where it is not at all clear that they are following the same protocols when they're off the mountain than they are here. But when they are here, they have to mask, which is why we've not seen a single documented case of a transmission of the virus between faculty or staff and our students.
Quickly to spring sports, there was a question about whether the NCAA's decision on whether or not to hold spring championships will have any influence on our decision to compete in the spring. There are no fall NCAA championships. They're waiting on winter basketball and swimming championships. Spring championships haven't been determined yet. Does that have any impact, influence on our decision?
Looking for is either incontrovertible evidence that it is possible to compete unmasked in close proximity safely without transmission of the disease, or a commitment from our competitors to wear masks when they're competing. Those are the two.
Okay. All right, we have about 2 minutes left. Dr. Brigady, I wondered if you might have some closing comments to share with everybody. Thank you for your time tonight.
Sure. So let me say a few things. First of all, I suspect that notwithstanding everything that you all have heard over the last hour, that there still may be many of you who fundamentally disagree with this decision for a variety of reasons. Either because you simply desperately want to play, which I respect, and are therefore prepared to take a higher level of risk to yourselves or to your teammates or others in order to do so, or because you simply don't share our view of the science, which is fair enough. Because as I say, there is disagreement not only within our own conference, but indeed within and amongst other conferences around the country. I respect that. And I also very much respect the fact that notwithstanding all of that, you may still be very disappointed, even angry or otherwise. And I deeply regret that. And we will continue to do everything in our power to keep you and everybody else in this community safe. And we will continue to create opportunities and seek to create opportunities for you to be able to compete this winter and also this spring, consistent with the environment within which we find ourselves, and as we understand the virus from the best science available, as well as our own practice. You know, I am constantly told, as someone who's new to this community, that Sewanee is a family. And in families, you have challenges, have difficult conversations. In some ways, you can express your anger more to your family members than you can to anybody else, and I respect that. But we will get through this together. And eventually, we will be on the other side of this great generational challenge. And I'm grateful for your patience and your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Thank you all for watching tonight, for your time. Thank you for all the questions you asked. And if we didn't get to all of them, we'll try to reply to as many as we can. And I wish everybody happy and safe and a healthy holiday. Thank you all very, very much. Good night.